In the afternoon. The drinks are coming soon. Some of our panelists aren't able to join us today, so please bear with us. We're going to zoom out. We're going to look at the world outside of this country, outside of this city. And we have a really distinguished panel here. You're going to be hearing from Teresa Ribeiro in just 1 minute, the media freedom representative of the OSCE. We've also got Virginia Antonell from UNESCO, Penninckx from the Council of Europe, and Sarah Clarke from Article 19 right here. So I think we're just going to kick off without further ado, and we're going to hear from Teresa Ribeiro first.
Dear Excellencies, dear colleagues, dear friends, allow me to start by thanking you for this possibility to address you today, even though it is through the means of a pre-recorded message, as I'm already on my way to the annual meeting with the ministers of our 57 participating states. These are busy times for our organization. Last week I was proud to present 3 new tools to further media freedom. One of these tools is the brand new toolbox on the safety of journalists. In this toolbox, we collect national instruments and initiatives from participating states, aside from including a compilation of international standards, OSCE commitments, and various initiatives for the safety of journalists. I'm convinced that it will serve as a useful tool to trigger further action in order to close the implementation gap, and it will continue to grow as new measures are being adopted and realized. This toolbox also has a separate chapter on legal harassment and SLAPPs, the topic of discussions today. At its launch last week, we were honored to have the award-winning observer and Guardian journalist, Carol, with us, presenting our experiences, which I'm sure you are all aware of. One of the positive notes was to hear that a coalition of press freedom organizations have rallied behind her, but it clearly shows how much still is needed when it comes to protecting journalists who are faced with these money-drawing and nerve-wracking lawsuits. Which brings me to my visit to the UK a few weeks ago. Next to meeting with the Anti-SLAPP coalition, I met with several representatives from government and parliament. It will not come as a surprise that the topic of excessive legal claims against journalists was high on my list of topics to discuss. I commended their efforts in combating this problem, including by the recent Anti-SLAPP passage in the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, but at the same time stressed that a standalone law would provide more and broader protection. This would not benefit the media in the UK alone, but all other journalists who face the threat of a SLAPP in London. And, very importantly, it would set a good example in our region, where SLAPP are of concern to the media in a growing number of countries. During 2 recent roundtables in Skopje in North Macedonia and in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, we had experts from this region and experts from other places like the US and Canada, where they have much more experience with the threats of such lawsuits and answers to mitigate this. As said, also in the UK, I think some serious initiatives were introduced and improvement has been made. We have added to the safety of journalists toolbox both the UK model anti-SLAPP law and the warning notice of the Solicitors Regulation Authority on SLAPPs of November last year, for the inspiration of other states to show a possible way forward. Let us keep advocating for more of this. I want to conclude, so that journalists will not have to spend their time, money and energy on these legal claims, but instead being able to concentrate on their work, so important to our democracies and our common peace and security.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to turn first to Virginia Antonell at UNESCO. I can't see her, but I think she's with us.
I am.
Great. Thanks for joining, Virginia. Oh, there you are. Wonderful. To give us a bit of an overview of the main global trends, you know, UNESCO, you're looking at the whole world. We spent a lot of the past 2 days talking about what's happening in this city with law firms based in this country, many of their global implications. But it would be really great just to hear from you the sort of overview of the global trends when it comes to lawfare and SLAPPs, particularly as it relates to defamation, and then just a few brief examples of both what you think needs to happen and also what UNESCO's contribution to the problem is.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Mary, for this introduction, and thanks to the organizer for inviting me to this panel. Yes, to reply to your question, SLAPP is certainly one of the most concerning threats for journalists, and it's on the rise in many regions of the world, especially in Europe and in Latin America. And this has been stressed as well during the regional consultations held by UNESCO last year to mark the 10th anniversary of the UN Plan of Action for the Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity. And SLAPPs features as one of the main challenges for journalists, especially in cases related to defamation offenses against journalists, both civil and criminal. And one of the outcomes of these consultations was a call to member states to first introduce anti-SLAPP legislations at national level and also to reform civil defamation laws in line with international standards, also to limit damages claimed to the defendant in order to be appropriate and proportionate, and also to include safeguards against SLAPPs and forum shopping. And in this context, UNESCO last year launched an issue brief on the misuse of the judicial system to attack freedom of expression, because we saw that in many defamation cases against journalists, this can become SLAPPs. And so this issue brief that you can see here, and it's also available online, provides an overview of the global trends, challenges and responses worldwide on defamation laws with a special focus on abusive legal practices such as SLAPPs and forum shopping. And some of the main concerning and also interesting findings of this issue brief are an increased use of criminal defamation offenses against journalists worldwide, but especially in Latin America and in Europe. And at the same time, a slowdown in the previous trend towards the criminalization of defamation. And this has been in parallel with also an increase in the use of abusive legal practices such as SLAPPs and forum shopping. So this shows that SLAPPs have certainly gained a global interest. It's one of the main concerning challenges, not only for journalists, but also as abusive legal practice and also misuse of the judicial system. So it's really important to tackle these issues from different angles. And from UNESCO point of view, one of the main initiatives that have been put in place to tackle this issue are the Judges Initiative, which was launched in 2013. So this year marked the 10th anniversary of this initiative. And through this initiative, UNESCO engaged with over 36,000 judicial actors from more than 160 countries in the world to strengthen knowledge and raise awareness on international standards on freedom of expression, access to information, and safety of journalists. And these also include, of course, raise awareness on raising challenges such as SLAPPs, because, of course, judicial actors can also play a crucial role in identify SLAPPs cases and dismiss it at an early stage. So it's important to raise awareness among them. And the second initiative that UNESCO has put in place to indirectly tackle SLAPPs is the Global Media Defense Fund. Through the Global Media Defense Fund, UNESCO has been supporting non-profit organizations that run projects, among the others, that aims to support and provide legal assistance to journalists that face SLAPP cases, also to build the capacity of journalists to limit the risk of facing defamation causes. And at the same time, it's also important to support projects that give visibility to this issue through sensitization campaigns, conferences such as the one that we are having here today. And I would like to also take the opportunity to thank our partners and donors for this initiative, in particular Open Society Foundations for their support to the Judges Initiative, and to the Foreign Policy Center and the International Bars Association for their support. And as UNESCO, we are very glad to support them through our Global Media Defense Fund and the independent work that they do to raise awareness on this issue of SLAPPs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Virginia. I wanted to ask you one more question on the Global Media Defense Fund, because we've heard a lot today about different funds and initiatives and insurance schemes to help protect journalists and others who are slapped. So there's Rapporteur Shield, which we just heard about. There's a new network of civil society organisations that are building a partnership and a coalition. Tell us, and you mentioned the Global Media Defense Fund supports those who are doing advocacy and sensitivization around this issue as well. But can you say a little bit more about the work of that fund, what resources are available, how people can find out more about that?
Yes, I don't know if it's possible. I can also share some links at the end of this conference. Of course, we have a web page on the Global Media Defense Fund where you can find more information about the fund. There's a call for proposal that opens every year, through which organizations, non-profit organizations, civil society organizations can apply. All those that deal with the safety of journalists, who can provide legal support to journalists, who can raise awareness on issues related to freedom of expression and press freedom. So the call is now closed, but it opens every year, and we really encourage any organization that is working on prompting the safety of journalists and the protection of freedom of expression to apply to our funds. And as I said, the Foreign Policy Center, for example, and the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, they are also some of the organizations that are supported by the Global Media Defense Fund. And as I said, we're very glad to see that through our support and their independent work, we can have such events to raise awareness on SLAPPs and other issues undermining freedom of expression.
Great, thank you. So you'll post more about when the next call for proposals is and the budget and all those things. Journalists love deadlines. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to Patrick Penninckx now, who's going to talk. So we had the global view, and now we're zeroing in a little bit, somewhat, to the Council of Europe. And Patrick, you had some remarks you wanted to make about the work you're doing, which is very timely, actually. There are key decisions due to be made this week, so I wanted to hand the virtual microphone to you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, not in presence, but at least online. It's a remarkable event, and I followed it as much as I could. Remarkable because it sheds further light on the issue of SLAPPs, and that needs to be put in the limelight, and thank you for that. So in trying to address what SLAPPs are all about, I would just like to say that the Council of Europe stands for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. We want to protect the law as a safeguard for our democratic societies. But in the past days, we have heard how the law is being diverted, not to hold those responsible for mischievous acts to account, but to attack those who are defending public interest. In the first place, of course, journalists and other media actors, but certainly not only. Human rights defenders, ecological rights defenders, anyone promoting public interest is basically at risk. That's why the Council of Europe basically has taken a number of actions. And I think it's important to recall that institutions, and that's why you have UNESCO and so on the panel, and OSCE, representative of the freedom of the media, they're not oblivious to those situations. We try to respond to them. First response for us has always been the putting into place of the platform for the protection of journalists. I think the fact that so many of the persons that are present in the room and were participating in the panels actually have contributed to this platform, and a platform which allows not only for individual alerts to be given, but also, or resounded, but also more and more to look into systemic abuses. And I think that is an important, let's say, platform to alert governments to these developments and to ensure that they are being put in the limelight. The second is obviously our reports that we make on the situation, on the media situation in Europe. It's made by our Secretary General, the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, and highlights the situation of journalists in particular, media in general, but journalists in particular, and that's an important aspect as well. Now, I won't go into how did we get there, but just so that you know that an institution like ours also works through regulation. And therefore, we established an expert group that is mandated to draft a Council of Europe recommendation to member states on countering the SLAPPs. So for the past 2 years, high-level experts designated by the member states, as well as independent consultants, many amongst you have been panelists in this conference, and they have worked on a solid, comprehensive text aimed at providing guidance to states and other relevant institutions. So the current text that is now being put towards our steering committee on media and information society is actually bold and specific. The very recommendation will be discussed this week, but also adopted, I suppose, very shortly by our Committee of Ministers, and I have high hopes for the swift approval of that. Now, I won't go into a complete description of what that recommendation entails, but a couple of highlights, I would say. It provides a definition of SLAPPs, still a concept subject to different interpretations in many different jurisdictions, but within such a definition, we also highlight that both legal actions initiated and those merely threatened are included. That's important. We are also working not only on civil actions, but also those appearing in the administrative and criminal level. We address domestic SLAPPs, but we also address cross-border SLAPPs, multiple or coordinated SLAPPs, SLAPPs targeting anonymous public participation, often involving an additional layer of complexity, costs, and stress. So key terms such as public participation, public interest are illustrated, and following the draft, these are to be understood in a comprehensive and inclusive manner. Important consequences will derive from this approach, obviously. As I said, the recognition that SLAPPs do not only target journalists, although they surely are particularly concerned, but that these are also used against a wide range of other crucial participants to the public discourse, including civil society organizations, environmental activists, HR defenders, academics, only to name a few. We also applied an understanding of matters of public interest on which we recognize a right to receive information ranging from politics to justice, from health matters to corruption. We have indicated a number of intense SLAPP indicators, so to say. They're not to be seen as exhaustive, but they are provided to facilitate and guide the judicial and other authorities in identifying the legal action in question. What is crucial in there is that we talk about an imbalance of power, a request for disproportionate, excessive, unreasonable remedies, the engagement in unfavorable tactics such as forum shopping, These are amongst the features that may disclose the presence of a SLAPP case. So for us to put in place a comprehensive legislative framework is what we expect our member states to do following this. And in order to do that, also to encourage them to set up a number of procedural safeguards, including the early dismissal of claims against public participation, the stay of proceedings, security for procedural costs and damage, and cost shifting on the claimant upon determination that a legal claim constitutes a SLAPP. So these are just a couple of things that I would like to highlight, but of course we can go more into detail about it if you like.
Thank you so much. That's an incredibly helpful overview, and I'll make sure that we have time for questions from the audience on what the panelists so far have said. I wanted to turn to you, Sarah, because I mean, what Patrick's laid out and the great work that both UNESCO and the OSCE are doing are all good. I particularly picked up a phrase in what Patrick said, which was what we expect member states to do. So I'd love you to respond to the proposals that are on the table from the Council of Europe and the other panelists, and also to give maybe a bit of more unconstrained political analysis of what you think is likely to happen, what you think the opportunities are, what the risks are, than some of our other distinguished panelists are at liberty to divulge. What's going to happen? What's not going to happen? What's the risk? What are you hopeful about? What are you worried about?
Thanks, Mary, and thanks everyone online. Well, we're in a really uncertain moment. There's a lot at stake, and we have two major pieces of legislation. Obviously, the directive has been discussed a lot in the EU, and then so that's at draft level.
Yeah, say a bit more about the EU directive.
So basically, the Commission of the EU responded to actually a model directive that our coalition had drafted, which really had very strong protections. The member states, through the Council of the EU, came back and really watered that down in what's called the Swedish Compromise text. Parliament is very much on side with the case coalition for a stronger directive. Those three bodies are in what's called a troika at the moment. They're negotiating, and tomorrow is crunch time for the end of that. All of this must be completed before the European elections next June, but there is a desire to get this over the line before the end of this year. What we're particularly worried about is how the initial protections, particularly as they relate to cross-border cases, and the threshold of what constitutes a SLAPP, so this idea of what they want to term manifestly unfounded, that's like so high that basically no case would qualify.
Right.
So there's been a lot of pushback from Parliament, but it really remains to be seen. Meanwhile, as Patrick has said, the Council of Europe recommendation in its current draft form is really as good as it gets. It's brilliant. We see very, very high protections. It's best practice, the highest standards, but that's also subject to approval by the member states. And what's been strange in the process of these negotiations is our traditional ally states are not our friends in this advocacy. So calling out specifically Germany, the Netherlands, have completely opposed the early dismissal mechanism on the basis that A, they don't recognise that they have SLAPPs in their jurisdictions, and B, that it is an overreach from Brussels, an unbearable interference in their civil procedural law. And so what our worry is that they will do the same. We want to be really careful that that doesn't happen, because it would be very sad to see, it would be pathetic to see the current protections watered down. What the fear is after all of this, after 5 years of you see the amount of work in this room alone, we're part of a massive coalition who's been working on this day in, day out for 5 years, is we could end up with a directive which is commonly known as Daphne's Law, which would have done nothing to protect Daphne. It's so weak as to be useless. We can't back it. The family won't back it. it could amount to being worse than nothing at all. So that's where we are. So that's what's at stake in the European Union. And what we worry about, is that okay if I just say what the actual implications are? Well, number one, it's not going to stop SLAPPs, which are rising all the time in the bloc. And we also would see that in terms of how we advocate, there would be a complete fragmentation of efforts from the regional level to the national level. Now, this is only in the 27 member states, right? We've still got all the other states to deal with. So you would see, now we've prepared for this in case through the establishment of national level working groups, but it's going to be extremely hard to track all of those countries, and it'll really splinter. And that's really where we are. So the bright lights are UK, economic crimes, that's the first that we've seen, the first legislation we've seen, and we want to see that backed up by a standalone anti-SLAPP law that's got to make it into the agenda for the next government. Likewise, we're pretty happy with the Irish draft anti-SLAPP legislation within defamation reform. So we'd like to see that elsewhere. But at the same time, Daphne's sister spoke yesterday about just how bad, let's say, the Maltese proposals have been. And we spent a lot of time dissecting what was absolutely useless proposals. And the worry is that going to happen across Europe? The amount of time wasting, whereas if we saw a strong directive, there wouldn't be a need for this. So that's the kind of worry on that front. The Council of Europe's draft recommendation provides us with best practice. It's non-binding. States won't have to immediately transfer it into international law, but it does provide the highest set of standards, and we will advocate with states on the basis of those standards to bring their legislation into line. But the problem is outside of the EU, so thinking of non-EU Council of Europe members, we're talking Turkey, Georgia, Moldova, countries that you have, particularly in Turkey and Georgia, you have major concerns around the independence of the judiciary. So, you already have such an enormous problem with issues around the criminal law and its deployment against journalists. We're only beginning to scratch the surface on SLAPPs in those countries. And the question for us as CASE is, okay, how do we change our strategy from where we've been focused in largely rule of law based countries in the EU, UK, to those countries? And what the coalitions there are saying is, what they really need is trial monitoring and better comms around these cases. But they're so worried about tinkering with their legislation in case it opens up the opportunity for governments to pass even stricter legislation or more repressive legislation, that they don't want to go down the legislative reform route. So we've got our work cut out for us. What gives me great hope is how much we've achieved in 5 years. It's rare that you can really trace the beginning of a campaign, and it's just the beginning. So just like the economic crimes amendment here and the directive in Brussels, it's really just the beginning. And that's just as it comes to legislation. You've got to look at, you're going to see a development of case law, of judgments, of training of judges on SLAPPs. It's still pretty nascent, the term. We've obviously seen the beginnings of changes in the legal industry, recognition of the problem amongst the targets. So a lot has been achieved. There's an awful lot that I'm nervous about in the next couple of weeks and months.
Yeah, I was surprised when you told me that actually some of the states that are causing the biggest problem in terms of an EU directive are the countries that you would normally see as kind of more free speech, respecting and rule of law. What's going on there?
They see that the remedies we're looking for, so early dismissal in particular, they see it as it doesn't fit neatly within their civil procedural code. They see it as a very common law response. And I would say there's a little bit of we don't want British answers to European problems.
Right.
There's a little touch of that.
Yeah.
The Irish have been very strong, and it's not a coincidence that Ireland and Malta are the two who've moved to legislate, because they're both common law jurisdictions. It's easier.
Right.
It's just easier to have this mechanism, but where you have, like, the role of the judge is different in civil law countries. But what we've seen in addition to that is a complete denial of the problem in the countries,
Right.
despite mounting evidence to the contrary. We, in our advocacy, particularly with the Dutch, we also really highlighted, look, you know, media freedom is one of your biggest foreign policy issues, or at least it was under the former government. So do it for the good of the bloc. But they weren't buying that.
Yeah, and it's strange because several of the panelists mentioned forum shopping. And I mean, if you get the splintering into national efforts and national political debates, it's just going to be forum shopping on steroids again. And, you know, I mean, OCCRP, the Global Investigative Journalism Network, their motto is, it takes a network to defeat a network, right? You need a network response. And if anyone cops out, then
I know,
that's
exactly.
a problem, right?
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions? I have more questions, but I wanted to give the room a chance to ask any questions to any of the panelists. What I'm hearing from you as well, that the whole kind of global Britain, you know, we're doing really well on SLAPPs thing is not kind of the right messaging for Europe?
No, I actually think it is. I think it is, because there's a healthy competition.
Oh, I see.
There.
Right. Race to the top, not to the bottom.
Right.
Okay.
So I think, no, we can use it. We can use it, but
maybe not quoting Boris Johnson like the keynote speaker did yesterday. Yeah. Noted. Does anyone have questions for any of the panelists? And if not, then I can ask the panelists to respond to some of Sarah's points. Sure. But I just was conscious that we wanted to give people in the room. There's a lady back there who has her hand up.
Thank you so much. I've just got it's more like a comment, not a question, but if any of the panelists want to comment upon it, that would be helpful. I was wondering if the self-censorship, where is that in terms of, I mean, especially in the global south, media organizations are sometimes not at all, you know, they target journalists themselves, and they don't provide enough protection to the journalists' safety. And I did not hear any of the panelists speak about that. So if any comments on this particular aspect, that would be very useful.
Yeah, I will put that over to any of the panelists who want to speak about that. I mean, I can tell you personally, as a journalist who's worked in newsroom for many years in the global north, that self-censorship is the biggest problem. I mean, everything you have seen and heard over the last few days is the tip of the iceberg. It's the exceptions that prove the rule, which is that this actually gets out into light of day. And that even in this country, self-censorship is a massive problem. The other thing I would just say to other journalists in the room is, you know, anecdotally, I've come across, particularly in recent months, a lot of examples of where journalists in the most repressive and challenging circumstances are getting letters from law firms based in London on the behest of either brutal regimes or the associated cronies that are making lots of money out of those systems. So I know for a fact that one of the things that's massively underreported on, because they are the last people in the world who want to go public with this problem, is the way that this problem is exported overseas, and the threats in jurisdictions that have much tougher, you know, criminal sanctions and penalties that this legal industry in this country is complicit with. So I can't even, I'll go to the panelists now, but it's just, so you've clearly touched on an issue which is vastly important the world over, and I would be sure that there's an imbalance of power there as well. But perhaps to Virginia or Patrick to respond first, and then I'll come to you,
Sure.
Sarah.
I'll go first then.
Yeah.
Thank you for this question, Judith. Censorship is a big problem, not only in, like I would say, worldwide, especially in Latin America. I think there's even a problem of numbers of killings of journalists, and this, of course, even raised more the problem of censorship, self-censorship, and also chilling effect on other journalists. So I agree with Mary and with the comment from the audience. Censorship remains one of the biggest problem and side effects of attacks against journalists and SLAPPs as well, because the burden that SLAPPs bring to defendant is overwhelming in terms of legal expenses, in terms of psychological effect, in terms of bankruptcy, in terms of censorship. And this also has an effect on, of course, other media outlets, other journalists. So I agree that it's a big issue, more in some regions than others. And this is also something that has to be taken into account through joint actions from different angles.
Thank you so much. Patrick, do you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, certainly. We did a study, a survey amongst 1,000 journalists a couple of years back, where self-censorship was indeed identified as one of the key issues. When we're now talking about SLAPPs, it's probably also because we had a follow-up study on how resilient can journalists be in this situation where there are so many effects or let's say a situation in which they are more or less forced to back up. What is it that makes them resilient to that situation? The first to be interviewed in that context was Daphne Caruana Galizia in October 2017, only a week after that she was unfortunately murdered. And that basically caused us as Council of Europe also to take the issue of SLAPPs to the foreground. I think what Sarah is saying also is that, yes, the European Union may have a certain orientation that it is taken. The Council of Europe has probably a more comprehensive approach.
Yeah.
The issue of to which extent is that going to translate in national legislation is obviously an issue, but at the same time, if we set those standards as we have done before, like for example, the recommendation of 2016 on the protection of journalists, also gives us a benchmark and even gives the European Union a benchmark in which direction to develop. I think it's not only a question about legal initiatives, it's also a question about how these legal initiatives are embedded in the work that journalist organizations are doing, human rights defenders are doing, like, for example, and that's why we launched a month ago a campaign, or 2 months ago in the meantime, a campaign for the protection of journalists, where we want to work not only at the European level, but also bring it down to the national level, where we can demonstrate the ways forward on how at a European, but also at the national level, we can ensure that journalists are heard and that the recommendations being provided are also translated in national practice. We have one safeguard in a way, which is the European Court of Human Rights, because the European Court of Human Rights will also refer back to the recommendations that are elaborated by the Council of Europe. So that's a little bit of a safeguard, of a security net that we have established, I think.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that the point is I wanted to give credit to the Anti-SLAPP Coalition and FPC in particular, because I think to Patrick's point about the solutions and remedies are not only legal ones, right? It is about us journalists getting together and all standing up on our chairs at the same time and saying, "I'm Spartacus, I have been slapped," and to have that encouragement and that organisation, the facilitation to do that, is about changing the culture, right? Changing the culture around self-censorship, recognising that if we speak together in large number, we have that safety net, that collective safety net. And so, yeah, there are all kinds of legal and political and policy remedies, but it is also about us recognizing that we have collective power and voice and agency. And that's been one of the most important developments in all of this, because to your point, Sarah, things become political football with the best frameworks and the highest standards in the world, which can be set by the Council of Europe. Some of this gets bogged down. So it's about having both of those things happening at the same time. Do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think Patrick, again, you know, we're so happy with the level of the draft recommendation. It is like it's just as good as it gets, and we really see this. It's been very helpful in our advocacy toward Brussels as well, because we've said there's absolutely no reason why you can't be as ambitious as the Council of Europe, of which they're all member states in any case. So we would, you know, politically, we've really welcomed that. It's been very useful. I just hope they're listening in Brussels. That's my main concern at the moment. There's a lot of competing priorities, and we're seeing this in the European Media Freedom Act as well, that there's kind of a bit of a race to the bottom, and we would hate to see so much work go to waste, and in a manner in which we couldn't even support it.
Yeah.
But that's also, I believe, if I may say so, the role of those countries which are now not part of the European Union and which are advocates for freedom of expression, to take up their responsibility. I think they're handed somehow an issue on a golden plate in a way. I think it is important for countries which are now not, well, of course, all ones that are party to the European Union, but also the ones that are outside the European Union and which are strong advocates for the protection of journalists, to play their role and demonstrate how things can be done differently. I personally believe very strongly that our campaign for the protection of journalists will have to count on those examples of good practice which will set a standard, and not the medium average way of dealing with things, but clearly stating those countries that can give a positive vision and view of how things can be done differently. And there, I believe, well, it's not only about the UK, but where the UK, for example, can play an important role. The UK right now, at the level of the Council of Europe, are chairing the group of friends on media freedom.
Yeah.
These are tools to be used. I think it is important that once a country has taken on a certain responsibility, even if it's among a group of friends, I think it is important that this be taken very seriously and used to promote, for example, the recommendation against SLAPPs. It's not just a piece of paper. I think when 46 countries sign up for that, even though they do not have to immediately translate it into national legislation, it sets a benchmark.
Yeah.
And that benchmark we have to put strongly, firmly into place and say, you guys, this is what we want. I think it's, and it's adopted by the 46 states of the Council of Europe.
Thank you. I'm really encouraged to hear that there is at least one example where the UK is not at the front of the race to the bottom.
Yeah. There's Global Britain. It can do this.
You mentioned as well, I mean, Ukraine, you were saying that there's a ton of libel and other SLAPP actions going on even amidst the war. I know this was a problem before the war. This was a big problem in Ukraine before the war, so I was curious to hear about that.
Yeah, just that was surprising to me that even these cases can continue. So there's been a number of those cases come to light to the Case Coalition recently.
Right.
So I think, you know, we've seen a lot of changes to the Ukrainian Media Media Act, and that this is an issue that we need to be working on in this in a context of what we can only imagine will be a prolonged state of conflict.
Yeah.
To get back on this, and as Ukraine, you know, as a candidate country now,
Yeah,
within
exactly.
the EU, it's got to bring a lot of its corruption and media freedom law into line.
Well, absolutely. And yeah, it's chosen a side, and so I think that's a really important conversation to have. I think we are out of time. If you have more questions, well, at least for Sarah or me, then feel free to pose them in the break or over drinks later. Thank you so much to all my panelists. It's been great to hear from you all. Thank you all for staying in the graveyard slot. We appreciate you being here.